The morning Sergeant Dara Fenn walked into the 3rd Battalion's evaluation room at Fort Carson. The air had that particular quality it gets in October at altitude, thin and cold and indifferent to whatever you thought mattered. There were 11 soldiers in that room. 10 of them looked at her the way men sometimes look at a woman who has placed herself somewhere they believe she has no business being, not with open hostility. That would have been easier to work with. It was something quieter and more practiced, a kind of studied inattention, the way you don't look at something you've already decided isn't worth looking at. Fenn sat down, pulled out her notebook, and wrote the date. She had been doing this for 7 years. Not the notebook, the being in rooms where she was the one that nobody was looking at. She had learned early that the most dangerous thing she could do was make it about that, so she didn't. She looked at the whiteboard at the front of the room, read the evaluation criteria that had been written there the night before, and made a note about the wind direction category being incomplete. Major Aldridge walked in at 0607. He was a tall man with the posture of someone who had spent a career being taller than most people in the room and had learned to occupy space accordingly. He set his folder on the desk without looking up, found his chair, and then, as if he had to confirm something he already knew, scanned the room once. His eyes stopped on Fenn for roughly 1 second, then moved on. "Right," he said. "Let's get started." The evaluation was a combat marksmanship assessment, a tiered program that Fort Carson ran twice a year for soldiers being considered for positions in the battalion's advanced reconnaissance unit. It was not a program that had ever produced a woman. This was not a rule. It was simply what had happened, which is a different thing, though the difference is sometimes difficult to explain to the people who benefit from the way things have always happened. Fenn had been recommended by her company commander, Captain Reyes, who was a practical woman with an exceptionally low tolerance for wasted potential. Reyes had watched Fenn shoot for 6 months. She had watched Fenn qualify at ranges that most of the male soldiers in the company would call, quietly and among themselves, unreasonable. She had submitted the recommendation without ceremony, the same way she submitted every administrative document that crossed her desk, as a statement of fact, not an argument. The recommendation had moved up the chain. It had been reviewed. It had been approved. And then it had landed in Major Aldridge's in-tray, where it had sat for 11 days before he had called Reyes and said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing each word, like a man navigating a minefield, "Captain, I want to make sure your soldier understands what she's walking into." Reyes had said, "She does, sir." There had been a pause. "All right," Aldridge had said. And that had been the end of that conversation, though both of them understood it was not the end of anything. The first phase of the assessment was written: ballistics theory, environmental reading, equipment maintenance protocols. Fenn finished it in 41 minutes. The next fastest was a staff sergeant named Briggs, who finished in 53. She handed her paper in, returned to her seat, and read the wind category notes she'd made that morning. Nobody said anything. The second phase was practical. They took the candidates out to the range at 0900 in a cold that had teeth in it, the kind of cold that made your hands do things your brain hadn't authorized. The targets were set at 300, 600, and 900 meters. This was not the hard part. The hard part came after. Fenn had been shooting since she was 9. Her father, Warrant Officer Emil Fenn, retired, had taken her out to a field outside of Drumheller, Alberta, the summer after her 3rd grade year, and placed a .22 in her hands and explained that a firearm was a tool that required the same respect as any other tool, neither fear nor carelessness, just attention. She had shot her first grouping at 100 meters that afternoon. 3 shots in a pattern her father had measured with his thumb. "Again," he'd said. She had shot again. The pattern tightened. He had nodded, put his coffee back to his lips, and said nothing more about it. That was how she had learned that she was good at this, not from praise, but from the specific texture of her father's silence. By the time she was in her 20s and wearing the uniform, she understood that the gift, if it was a gift, had something to do with stillness, not physical stillness, though that was part of it. The other kind. The kind that happens inside when everything external is trying to crowd in and make you forget what you're actually doing. She could put it all somewhere. The cold, the noise, the 11 soldiers in a room who weren't looking at her. She put it somewhere, and then she looked at the target and she did the thing. On the 900-meter target, her grouping was the tightest of the day. She knew it. She didn't say it. The third phase was what Aldridge called the pressure scenario. Candidates were given a notional mission environment, a set of environmental variables, wind speed, temperature, elevation shift, target movement pattern, and asked to calculate a firing solution without instrumentation. Just the data, just the math, just the understanding of what happens to a bullet when the air is what it is, and the distance is what it is, and the target is doing what the target is doing. Fenn had spent the better part of her adult life thinking about this. Not obsessively. Just the way you think about the thing you are genuinely good at, which is different from the way you think about a problem. It was more like a conversation she was always in the middle of, even when she was doing something else. She worked through the scenario in 40 minutes. The firing solution she submitted had an error margin of less than half a minute of angle. Aldridge didn't announce scores. That was his process. He collected the papers, and the results came back through official channels, typed on a form, impersonal and precise, which was fine. Fenn had not come here for acknowledgement. She had come here because she was the right person for this assessment and the position it led to. And she understood the difference between those two things, even if not everyone in the room did. But then something happened that was small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, and significant enough that Fenn did not miss it. After collecting the papers, Aldridge reviewed them at the front of the room. He moved through each one, quickly making a mark. When he got to hers, he stopped. He looked at it for longer than he had looked at the others. Then he set it at the back of the stack, not the front, and looked up. "We'll have formal results by end of week," he said. Briggs, to Fenn's left, leaned back in his chair in the particular way that men lean when they are satisfied. The others gathered their gear. Fenn wrote down the time in her notebook. The results came back on Thursday. Every name was listed in order of composite score except one. The entry that should have read Sergeant D. Fenn, followed by a numerical score, read instead, "Score withheld pending technique review." Fenn read that line 3 times. She was sitting in the company's administrative office when she read it, and Sergeant First Class Dharma Lau was at the desk across from her. And Lau looked up once, read her face with the accuracy of someone who had known her for 4 years, and said nothing. Fenn folded the paper. She put it in her notebook. She stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the parade square for a moment, and then turned back. "I'm going to talk to Aldridge," she said. Lau said, "Okay, I'm going to ask a procedural question." "I know," Lau said. "That's good. That's the right thing." She requested the meeting through the proper channels and received the slot the following morning at 0800. Aldridge's office was on the 2nd floor of the battalion HQ building, and it had a window that looked out over the motor pool, and he was standing at that window when she came in. "Sergeant Fenn," he said, without turning. "Sir." He turned then and gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He sat. He had her file open in front of him, which told her he had been expecting this conversation, which told her something about the nature of the decision. "You're here about the technique review notation," he said. "I am, sir. I'd like to understand specifically what was observed and whether those observations were documented during the assessment or after the composite score was calculated." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. He had the face of a man who was deciding how honest to be, which was a particular kind of face, not dishonest exactly, but measuring. "Some issues were noted with your firing position during the pressure scenario," he said. "In what way?" "Your position was non-standard." Fenn held the word for a moment, looked at it from a few angles. "Sir," she said, "the manual describes a recommended position. It doesn't prescribe a prohibited position. My firing solution had an error margin of under half a minute of angle. If my position is producing that result, I'd like to understand what the concern is with the position itself. Standards exist for a reason." "They do," she said. "I agree. Which is why I'd like to know which standard I didn't meet and where that standard is documented, so that I can either correct my technique or understand if this is a documentation issue." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. Aldridge looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in the evaluation room, the 1-second assessment followed by moving on. He looked at her the way you look at something that is just demonstrated. It is more structurally sound than you assumed. "I'll have the documentation reviewed," he said. "Thank you, sir." She stood. "I appreciate it." She was at the door when he said, "Sergeant." She stopped. "Your firing solution was the best submitted." She turned slightly but not fully. "I know, sir," she said, and left. The review came back clean. There was no documentation of a technique deviation during the assessment. The notation was removed. Her score was entered into the record. It was the highest composite in the cohort, by a margin that was not close. The battalion adjutant, a careful man named Whitmore, processed the paperwork with the efficiency and emotional neutrality of someone who processed the paperwork for a living. He did not comment on the score. He did not comment on the sequence of events. He stamped the form and filed it and moved on to the next item in his tray. Fenn received her results on a Monday morning, the same way she had received them the first time, through official channels on a typed form. She read it at her desk in the administrative office. Lau was across from her again, doing something on her computer. Fenn looked at the score. She set the paper down. "Well," Lau said, "top of the cohort." Lau looked at her for a moment. She said, "I know." What followed was not a ceremony. The advanced reconnaissance unit didn't work that way. There were no speeches and no handshakes in a formal line. Fenn got an email telling her to report to the unit's briefing room at 0700 the following Wednesday. She showed up. There were 6 other soldiers there, the top scorers from the cohort, minus the technique review delay. They had clearly already been briefed in some capacity because there was a settled quality to the room. One of them, a corporal named Evers, looked at her when she came in and nodded. Once, the way soldiers nod when they have decided that something is a fact. She nodded back and took her seat. The unit commander, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Shaughnessy, came in at 0703 and stood at the front of the room without preamble. "You're here because you're the best we had," she said. "That's the only reason people get into this room. You'll find there are no other reasons and there are no exceptions to that rule. Any questions before we begin?" Nobody spoke. "Good," said Shaughnessy. "Then let's get to work." 3 months later, Aldridge ran into Captain Reyes outside the battalion mess, in the particular way that people run into each other when they both know it isn't entirely accidental. He had something he seemed to want to say. Reyes had the patience to let him find it. "Your soldier," he said, finally. "Fenn." "Yes, sir. She's performing well in Shaughnessy's unit." "Better than well." "Yes, sir, she is." He nodded, looked somewhere past her shoulder at the tree line. There was something in his expression that was not quite regret and not quite pride, and lived somewhere in the narrow territory between the two. "She asked the right question," he said. "In my office. She didn't make it about anything except the documentation. She stayed procedural. Reyes considered this. That's how she was trained, sir." "Is it?" he said. "Not a question." "In part," Reyes said. "The rest is just who she is." He nodded again. The tree line held whatever it was holding. He said, "Right," and went inside. Fenn was in the field the day that conversation happened, somewhere in a terrain she had been given 48 hours to map and surveil and make sense of. She was 2 hours into a stalk that had required her to move 1,100 meters through mixed ground in 3 hours of diminishing light, and she was thinking about the wind, which had shifted twice since she had last stopped to recalculate. She was thinking about her father's thumb, the way he had measured that first grouping, and said nothing. She found her position, settled into it, and let everything else go somewhere else. The weeks before, the form with the notation, the room full of men who hadn't looked at her. She put all of it down like something she'd been carrying without noticing, and when it was down, she could feel how her hands were steady and the cold had stopped being a problem and the wind was exactly what it was. She looked through the scope. The target was there. She made the adjustment she had calculated. She breathed out slowly. And then she did what she had always done, which was the only thing she had ever needed to do. She waited until the moment was exactly right, and she took the shot.